Welcome back. We're talking about Women's Month as we head towards Women's Day on the 9th of August. We're talking about the erasure of women, particularly black women, from the history of apartheid South Africa and, of course, post-democracy South Africa. We're considering how exclusionary and discriminating patterns are reproduced through attempts to construct national memory archives. A very good evening once again to Zubeida Jaffer, who is a South African journalist, author and activist, and we're also speaking to Natasha Allie, acting CEO of the Oliver and Adelaide Tambo Foundation. So just before we went on the break, we were looking back at what we have done wrong. Now, with regards to nation building, and as I said, recreating a collective memory, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a project, how did that do? How did it fail in establishing some of these things that we're talking about?
I don't think so. I think that it was an amazing, for that period, it was an amazing record which we all were participating in. We were watching, we were observing, and if that hadn't happened, we would not have been able to say, that we have a national record of what had taken place. But at the same time, it's up to us now to dig deeper, and we know that there are many concerns about the undone work of the unfinished business of the TRC, and definitely what's happened to women has been, has sometimes been neglected. But I don't think that we can say we haven't made progress at all. And I do feel that the work has to be done by the creatives. The digging and the telling of the stories has to be done by the creatives, because it took me 3 years to kind of put together the story of Mum Charlotte. And it was a lot of really digging and hard work. So there's no shortcut to that.
Okay.
And so we have to encourage our young people and our young writers to take on this job.
Natasha, how is your foundation doing that, excavating not only the importance, the possibilities of creating a new colonial archive, the voices, the text of the historically marginalized people? How have you done that in terms of incorporating it into national projects or just remembering and notions of belonging?
For the foundations, it's really important because, as you know, we're called the Oliver and Adelaide Tambo Foundation. And in its establishment, it was very important that Mrs. Tambo, Mum Adelaide Tambo, was included in the naming of the foundation. For this very reason, there would not be an Oliver Tambo had it not been for Adelaide Tambo. So a lot of our work is centered around remembering her legacy and doing projects in her name, projects that she was passionate about, carrying on that legacy work. Because, for example, one of the dialogues we run is called Not Just a Wife. And it's about deconstructing the definition of a freedom fighter. I think when we think of freedom fighters, we think of men. And that is, it's as ridiculous as it is wrong. Women held the fort, yes. Women were soldiers, women were educators. But I don't think enough recognition is given to what the country would have looked like when these alleged male freedom fighters returned had there not been women, Life carried on, but women also fought here on the front line. So a lot of the work of the foundation is in keeping the legacy of women, not only Matambo, alive.
Zubeida, as you are talking about the pictorial existence of some of these examples, somebody like Zanele Mhloli has drawn criticism, but also has risen to international recognition because of how she defines contemporary citizenship and what it ought to represent currently. So how do we use these tools to teach young women about that agency, the identity within the South African context, just with also within the body of work of women in this country, to remind them that they come from a stock of women who really were at the forefront of some of these achievements?
Well, I've been trying to, myself and my daughter, have been trying to make a lot of effort with the support of a team of people to focus on the 3 stories that I've written about women. And so we are trying, because the challenge is really that one can write these stories, but if people don't read and people don't engage and they don't discuss, then it's almost pointless. So what we are having to do is to, what we are doing, trying to do is to engage with groups of young people and encourage them to read and discuss the books, the story on Mum Charlotte. I'm particularly concerned about her story because this has been the year of Charlotte Maxeke, and I get the impression that there's been a focus on her name and perhaps some of the sort of things that she's achieved, but there's been no attempt to deepen the process.
Okay, we'll see.
For people to study. Our minds will be blown because she's a really strong example of a forceful woman.
Natasha, perhaps to wrap up, we were talking about the issue of voices and the type of voices who then ought to be representative of this cohort that we're speaking of. Recently, the UCT and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie debacle brought to the fore some of these issues, how cross-cutting they can be, but also how divisive they can be. So how do we go about doing that work so that we say nobody is left behind, that some women are themselves not erased in the telling of this history?
I think it's really important that we follow narratives on an individual and a collective basis. I think it's really important that we know the stories of the women in our own families, in our own communities, while simultaneously learning about women, you know, on a national, global front, continental also front. There are stories and things happening right now. And while we acknowledge, you know, Caster Semenya, Tatiana Schoonmaker, those great things, I think sometimes we don't even know the stories of our moms and grannies and great grannies. And I think as much as South Africa continuously embodies the spirit of Ubuntu, as we like to say, I think it's very important to tackle that on an individualistic and collectivist aspect. So knowing your own story, knowing the story of your family, and retelling those stories, in that way you will be able to actually have a greater and more accurate national narrative.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. Natasha Allie, whom you've just heard there, is the acting CEO of the Oliver and Adelaide Tambo Foundation. We're also in conversation with Zubeida Jaffer, who is a South African journalist, author and activist. Thank you very much to you.